Good evening to our participants in Asia, good afternoon to Europe, and good morning to the United States. I'm David Goldman, Asia Times Deputy Editor, and it's my privilege to welcome two experts on military affairs and particularly the situation in the Pacific, Elbridge Colby, and of course, Asia Times editor Uwe Parpart. Now, Bridge Colby is known, at least by his work, if not by name, to Asia Times readers because when he was the principal author in 2018 of the Trump administration's national defense strategy, we covered it extensively, and that document really set a new and high standard in defense analysis for the United States. At the time, Mr. Colby was Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Defense in charge of strategy and force development. Uwe Parpart, of course, is Asia Times editor. I should mention that he has extensive military background as an officer in the German Navy at the peak of the Cold War. He participated in many staff exercises and saw a great deal of the unfolding of the Cold War from the inside. The format today is really a conversation between Bridge Colby and Uwe Parpart. I'll be listening along with the rest of you. Your questions are important to us and most eagerly solicited. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A button. If you have a question at any time, please write up your question. I will be reading them and in some cases consolidating them for the sake of time. We'll go for about half an hour in the two-way discussion and then break for questions. So with that, the floor is yours, gentlemen. Welcome and thank you very much for participating.
Okay, David, thank you very much for this introduction. Bridge, it's a great pleasure having you on here tonight in Hong Kong and this morning in the Americas, and hopefully we'll present something to the audience that will give them some food for thought. The way I'd like to introduce it is by making two very brief sort of introductory comments. The theme is, as announced, what might bring about a war in the Pacific, and if God forbid it were to happen, who would in fact perhaps win it, assuming that there could be an actual winner in this kind of engagement. The reasons why wars start are multifarious. There's anything from religious wars in the post-Middle Ages to very economically driven wars that we've seen at different times in the history. What is going on at the moment in the Pacific that we should pay attention to in terms of a potential casus belli, in terms of a cause for war? There is the so-called Thucydides trap theory that's been developed, that you have a situation in which the new power on the scene, in this case China, is challenging the established power, in this case the United States. And under those circumstances, some have said it is near inevitable, much as the contest between Sparta and Athens, that indeed a bellicose outcome is going to be the most likely outcome. I'm not convinced of that, but at any rate, that's what is much of the thinking at this point in time. I have a couple of remarks to make about that in terms of what I think is a likely cause of war, if there were to be one in the Pacific. During the Trump administration, in which Elbridge served, the contest was essentially an economic, financial one. It morphed into something, different and perhaps more ideologically shaded at a later point. But ultimately, it started with a situation in which I believe President Trump felt that the United States had been dealt a bad deal over the years, and this needed to be rectified. And that's why it became a trade war as opposed to a hot war. Those kind of wars, I think one can actually resolve by making a deal. On the other hand, if it becomes something more of an ideological or even religious type of war, then the difficulties arise, and this might be much more difficult to resolve. What is it at this point in time with the Biden administration? I think from the emphasis on trade and economics, the contest between the United States and China has become more of a contest over systems, if you will, ideologically, perhaps expressed of democracy versus autocracy. A systematic or systemic situation in which it may be much more difficult to reach actual agreements. And from the Chinese standpoint, of course, this is a situation in which they feel that the very way in which they are actually pursuing their path to greatness is being challenged. And from the United States point of view, democracy and republicanism as a principle, small r, are the actual precepts by which this is being fought. Now, in terms of an actual war, what could and would cause a war? I think that's been played through for, well, at least since the 1950s. There have been near wars over Taiwan ever since the 1950s, ever since 1949, excuse me, when of the foundation of the People's Republic of China. And there were various times at which there were actual military engagements over Taiwan. And if there is to be any kind of situation that leads to war, I think this would be the most likely cause of war. Bridge, if you disagree, please let me know. And the second question is, if it were indeed to come to this type of situation, what might be the outcome? On that, I have various issues and various points to make. I just want to very, very briefly now mention one of my own experiences in a staff exercise in 1983 called Able Archer, in which the United States and NATO, and of course the US as principal actor, especially on the nuclear side within NATO, actually played through in November of 1983, starting on 7 November and prematurely aborted on 11 November, what would actually happen. And I was on the NATO side at that time, and we lost it. We got to a point where the orange side, nowadays perhaps better known as the red side, actually overran us, in the matter of 3 days on the basis of conventional attack. And it was then a question of going to the highest level of defense, DEFCON 1, and looking at the possibility of nuclear intervention. That was then played through. DEFCON 1 was called. And the actual exercise involved, in fact, the two heads of state at the time, Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl on the West German side. There was a bunch of discussion over whether or not President Reagan should be involved. The new, at that time, new National Security Advisor, Robert McFarlane, made a very strong point saying, let's not do that. That may be totally misinterpreted, so let's not get Ronald Reagan involved. That was probably the thing that prevented an actual outbreak of nuclear war at the time. Because it was then at least plausible for the NATO side to say, look, this is a staff exercise, not the case, what the Russians called RIAM, which means nuclear missile attack, first strike nuclear missile attack. I hope that I will never be, as an observer, certainly not as a participant, be involved in this kind of situation. It was scary as hell, and it made a lasting impression, I think, on everybody who was involved in it, including on President Reagan at the time, who believed that this was the need, this defined the need for getting rid of the mutually assured destruction doctrine, otherwise known as MAD, and actually going for a defensive posture. Okay, well, that's where we stand. So maybe we divide it in two parts: potential causes of war, and what to do about it to prevent it. Albert, please.
Well, sure. Well, thank you, Uwe and David. It's great to be on with Asia Times. I've been a great fan of Asia Times for a long time. David's work, as well as many others who've written, I think, ahead of the curve. As Asia Times brand is to be ahead of the curve, not only on Asia issues but strategy more broadly. So a pleasure to be on with you and with the Asia Times as an institution. Well, I mean, there's a tremendous amount to unpack in, I think, what Uwe you laid out. I have probably a somewhat different view, but I think maybe just briefly, so to open up the conversation, I would say I do think the chances of war are real. And I think Graham Allison, for whom I have a high regard, I don't agree with on many things, including Taiwan, but I think is right that we are entering a period of, sort of, as the academics say, a power transition situation. And that is a moment at which war becomes possible. I tend to worry a lot more, and I said this to some Chinese counterparts, actually last week, the week before. I'm more worried about a deliberate decision, which could be a kind of quote unquote misperception. It'd be more of a political or strategic misperception in the way that, like, Japan misassessed US resolve in 1941, rather than a derivation from accident or a misassessment of exercises or something. I mean, we're in a very different world from a kind of military posture and strategic posture point of view than 1983. My understanding of 1983, you participated in directly, but my understanding is that the chances of a major war were less than are sometimes thought. But that's that's for historians to dispute. But look, I think China is growing has grown enormously in power, and I don't need to tell anybody in Asia that. I mean, it's patently clear to everybody else, obviously, as Xi Jinping himself points out, allegedly quoting Napoleon, although it's not clear whether it actually said it. But if he didn't, he should have. When China wakes, the world will shake, and of course, the world is now finally shaking. Obviously, the People's Republic, China stood up, as Mao Zedong said, but now it's really standing up thanks to Deng Xiaoping and the opening and so forth. And the rest of us have to deal with it. And we can't know exactly what the Central Committee is planning. I mean, my view is we don't know. The Central Committee itself doesn't know what it will do in a few years, maybe even a few weeks. So anybody who speaks as if they have total certainty about what the future intentions of the Chinese leadership are, I don't find it very credible, because intentions can change. And But what we can say is China is tremendously powerful. It has enormous economic weight, but it also has a far, far more capable military, not only a military designed for the defense of the PRC itself, which was obviously the primary mission of the PLA for most of the history of the People's Republic, but also not just for the potential coerced unification of Taiwan with the mainland, but also increasingly a power projection military. That is a military that will be able, like the United States military, to project military power not only through the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia, already has a navy that's larger than the United States. I mean, yes, the US has some qualitative advantages, although those are eroding and China seeks to erode them, but also quantity has a quality all its own, as Stalin liked to put it, and that matters a lot. And of course, China has the other accoutrement of a power projection military, space architecture, Air Force, et cetera, Marines. So this is the reality, and I think we've seen China blow through, frankly, many of its old evidences of restraint. I mean, the no overseas basing and no overseas operations, the minimal deterrent on its nuclear forces. Of course, the Chinese have a way of, PRC has a way of spinning that, but I think it's pretty evident to all to see that, you know, China's willing to use force. I mean, we can see it at Whitsun Reef, the Philippines just recently, of course, the economic coercion vis-a-vis Australia, and against the Indians in Ladakh, you know, with lethal force. So this is the reality. And I mean, I don't agree with Dr. Kissinger on a lot of things, but where I think he's right is this is basically mostly about power and influence. It's not about ideology. So, you know, I mean, I'm a firm believer in US American republicanism, but I don't think it's the job of American foreign policy or the right way to look at foreign affairs, primarily through an ideological prism. I mean, ideology makes a difference, but I tend to see it as secondary or tertiary. What's really happening is China's becoming very strong. Even if it had a different system of government, I think we would have problems with it. They might be attenuated, but I think they would still exist. And I think it also will make dealing with China more difficult. So, I mean, my view is that we need to make, we, the Americans and others who are concerned about a domineering China, obviously countries like Japan, Vietnam, Taiwan, of course, India, Australia, I think South Korea in many quarters. These countries need to make clear to China that the use of force would be ill-advised, because I think the primary danger, to get back to Uwe, your point, is that China will assess that the use of military force, of course, coupled with other instruments of national power, would be a rational course of action. I think that is the primary danger. And I think what Admiral Davidson was saying before he retired a few months ago was, look, I mean, China could have a rational course of action vis-a-vis Taiwan, and we don't want to get in that position. You know, and I'm always sort of flabbergasted a little bit among Americans who think that that's impossible. I mean, the United States itself embarked on a number of ill-advised wars, but nonetheless wars in the last couple of decades. So it's not like great powers aren't willing to use military force if they think it's in their interest. I mean, we know it from sad personal experience. But I think the best way for us to deal with this problem, as I said, the Americans and others, is to make it very clear that China would not benefit in a practical and credible way that shows that we would deny China its ability to turn that into a victory of some kind at a reasonable cost. And then from that position of strength to look for détente over time. So not détente in the sense of a kind of a weary titan sort of. I think this is dramatically overwrought, these discussions of American decline. And I mean, if you just look at the numbers, we're doing a lot better than almost anybody else. So, you know, and China has huge problems as well. So, I mean, I don't take those very seriously. But the reality is that, you know, we don't want to get in an existential cage match, I like to call it, with China. We don't want China to miscalculate. But to me, this is a question of balance. And we need to be forceful now in order to get to a place where we can have more a more détente, a kind of a more relaxed position, but that's from a position of strength, and we're not where we need to be. So that's my, you know, I think the chance of war would most likely come in Asia from U.S. inattention and a U.S. unwillingness to be firm. Actually, is where the primary danger is now.
Yeah, right. I mean, I can see that point of view, and there are significant portions of what you said, Anders, that I actually agree with. But And one thing is certain that deterrence is a necessary element of any kind of peaceful solution. If you show yourself to be weak and unprepared and unable to deal with the situation, then somebody may think something is rational, even when in fact it is not. So I think that's a critical issue, and on that one we can certainly agree. I think that's been shown true to be the case in history. The one thing that I think is important here is that for China, almost certainly the most sensitive issue, looking at the country's history, is that it's not a nation state in the ordinary sense, right? It is made up of different bits and pieces. The Han ethnic bloc has shifted around. They have actually taken over and let go again of different parts of what is nowadays China during the various parts of history. The one thing that ever since the demise and the horrors of the decline, as far as China is concerned, of the Qing dynasty, is that everybody's always tried to break them up into bits and pieces, and those are, I think, at the moment the critical red lines. Not ideological issues, perhaps not economic issues, but does China suspect that the United States or the West, let's put it more broadly, is trying to break it up into manageable pieces as opposed to dealing with what it is right now? And there are at least two elements of that. One is Taiwan, and the other one is Xinjiang, obviously. And Xinjiang is a much more recent, if you will, acquisition of China in the 19th century. Taiwan is, well, we all know the history and no need to go into that. But I think this is where the red lines actually are. I was very encouraged a couple of weeks ago when Kurt Campbell, who was in charge of this, said that the ambiguity over Taiwan, which is actually the result of the United States agreeing in the 1970s to a one China policy, that the actual assumption on the part of China that Taiwan is part of China, but at the same time, the ambiguity that this doesn't mean you can just sort of march in there and impose your particular policy and politics. That remains the principal issue, right? And a potential, to me, of war.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a couple thoughts. I mean, I think you put your finger on it. I mean, first of all, I would disaggregate Taiwan in particular, and to some extent Xinjiang, but really Taiwan, from the question of whether we're seeking to break up the People's Republic as it exists today. I mean, I don't think there's anybody actively pursuing the breakup of the PRC. What I would say to people in Asia and China is China is a country of 1.4 billion people. Obviously, the Han are a developed kind of entity, although they themselves are a result of conscious policy, creation over the imperial period and since. But I think of China like Jupiter. It exerts a gravitational force that is immense, and frankly, China needs to understand. I mean, in a way, frankly, historical analogies are always fraught. But I mean, when Germany became a unified entity in the 19th century, it ended up exerting a gravitational force that was so great it created chaos. And I mean, it abetted that. It was not purely a passive actor. But I think China needs, and I don't think China, the leadership today is doing this, but when you're 1.4 billion people, you have to take extra precautions not to be menacing, because your very fact of existence, especially if you're as powerful and creative and impressive, I think, as David rightly puts it, I mean, I'm on David's page in terms of the capability of the Chinese people and the Chinese economy. That's what makes me worry, is I don't think China's got clay feet. I think they're really, China's finally, stood up, and now it's going to turn into if not Hong Kong, a lot more like it. And that's 1.4 billion people. And that's a gravitational fact that China needs to deal with. So if China is fearful, it also needs to recognize that that its very existence, in the way that Bismarck, I think, did recognize. I mean, we can criticize him in other ways, but I think he did understand that the fact of a unified Germany would just create fears in the rest of Europe that he at least tried to mitigate. His successors did not, or did so less well, but or more poorly. But so I think that's important. And I mean, to be frank, I think China sometimes, and again, I don't speak Chinese. I took a little bit when I was a kid, but I think China is a civilization unto itself, as you point out, and it's a huge country. And probably most people in China are thinking about other Chinese and the Chinese sort of mental market in the way that Americans do. If you're in California or New York, Americans don't see a lot of news from abroad compared to what they think about in their country. But that has a danger because people are mostly reacting just to their own internal market. So again, this is not a critique of China per se, but it's to say China's fears need to also be measured against the fear that they create, to go back to Thucydides, just as a fact of their power. I mean, that's a reality. So, Taiwan, just to be, not to get pedantic, but I think it's important. The US one China policy does not actually recognize China's claim over Taiwan. The US, what Kissinger said and what the communique said is that, the United States recognizes the Chinese on both sides of the strait say there's one China. The US doesn't take a position. Part of the US one China policy, as reflected in the Taiwan Relations Act and so forth, and now the 6 assurances, has been incorporated by administrations of both parties, is that we will look with grave concern upon the use of force to determine the fate of the people on Taiwan. So that's a very important point. And Kirk Campbell's comment the other day about strategic ambiguity, I think for any listeners in Beijing, I think they, I'm sure, have already recognized that the administration, I think to its credit, has sent a number of pretty clear signals that the United States would not just sit by and watch China use force against Taiwan. To the contrary, as the National Security Advisor, Kirk Campbell's boss, said, the United States would pursue its Taiwan policy with resolve and clarity. Secretary of State Blinken said that the United States, I think it would be a major mistake or something like that for China to do something. And the administration as a whole has said that the United States has a rock solid commitment to Taiwan. And they've spoken of the 6 assurances. So any Chinese reckoning that they will get away under the threshold of American intervention with the use of force against Taiwan, I think would be mistaken. Now, for our part, I don't think that anybody in the US is talking seriously about independence for Taiwan. I don't think that's something that US policy is pursuing. So I think there's plenty of room to discuss, but I think there's real worry in the US side because we hear, first of all, we see the facts, the metal being bent and the capabilities being developed to forcibly subordinate Taiwan, including by, as they say, countering US intervention. The Chinese, we call it A2AD, but China calls it, a counter intervention force. So they're clearly thinking about that. And, there are Google Earth images of US ships being shot at by Chinese test missiles. So, okay, we're big boys, we understand, big boys and girls. But that's something that's real, and they have a far more significant capability. And then we hear from Xi Jinping that he's not going to let the Taiwan issue pass on to future generations. And that makes us worried. So our point is not, I don't think we've been changing. I know the Chinese counterparts think differently, but I don't think we've been changing. The old policy of Henry Kissinger was in a very different era when the PLA had no capability to forcibly subordinate Taiwan. So we now live in a different era. But I think we've, hopefully the American side has communicated pretty clearly that we're not going to just roll over on that.
Yeah. I mean, there's no argument with that, and thanks for clarifying the matter of the joint communique there in 72 or 73, whenever it was. But China does regard Taiwan as part of China, and that I think we have to understand that. And they have also not ruled out the use of force. In fact, they have made it very clear that that's not ruled out. So where does that go? Well, let me just go back to your Bismarck comment for a moment. You you, like maybe many Americans, are not aware of the fact that one of the things that led to World War I was against Bismarck's will. And that was the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine after, after 1871, when Prussia actually won that particular war hands down in a matter of ultimately days. What is important is that Bismarck, as the ultimate realist, he had no ideology of any kind. He wanted to build a stable nation state called Germany, and he thought that if Alsace was going to be annexed to that, that would be, the pebble in the shoe, right, forever. And so it turned out. I mean, it had nothing to do with Serbia or Sarajevo or anything like that. That wasn't the reason.
Still trying to figure out what, I guess we're all trying to figure out
Anyway,
what caused the World War I still. Although it's relevant, I think. But, yeah.
Gentlemen, we want to move to questions in just a few minutes. So if you have a brief summary remark before we get to questions, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the issue of Taiwan and how and what that might look like, and the reason why I mentioned the Able Archer maneuver in the first place. At the beginning. If you look at the actual correlation of forces, if you look at the situation in conventional forces terms, the Taiwan military right now is effectively somewhere around 250,000. If you look at that, the capability of that military, it may be well trained, it may be well equipped, but when all is said and done, it's not going to be any more of a match than the 500,000 West German army that I served in was a match going to be to a massive conventional onslaught from the East Bloc. That raises the question that if indeed it came to a military confrontation, this would either force Taiwan or even the United States as a backer of Taiwan under those circumstances to at least make the nuclear threat. And the nuclear threat, this has been discussed recently by people whose historical knowledge you may not necessarily regard as accurate, but Daniel Ellsberg, for example, went through it.
Very smart guy. I don't always agree with his judgment. I'll say that.
Right. But it is a fact that the United States threatened the use of nuclear weapons.
Oh yeah, repeatedly against China. Yeah,
repeatedly against China. And my biggest concern is that just like there might be miscalculations on the part of China, there could be a serious miscalculation on the part of the West. Well, the West. I mean the Allied.
I'm not sure how relevant the West. Yeah, it's more the Asian
the US
allies.
Look at so let's just say Japan, Korea, and I'm not even sure about Korea, but let's just say Japan and the United States. And that is a real issue to me. I think it's a serious problem, and anything that can avoid that kind of confrontation at level of it, I think should be foreclosed before we get to it.
Totally agree with you, which is why I'm so keen on ensuring that the United States and Taiwan together have a conventional capability to deny a successful Chinese invasion or blockade, because then we won't get to the nuclear. Because it's it's totally possible, and it would be the riskiest thing that probably ever happened in the world. So we'd all be best off avoiding that. Just a couple brief points, because I know David wants to get to questions. I mean, I think I totally agree with you on the Alsace-Lorraine. I mean, that was was the sort of stick in the craw or whatever that helped, especially propel the anti-German coalition. So it was a terrible decision by the Germans. But But I think, you know, my sense is that, you know, if we, I kind of lost my train of thought, but I think the point was that, you know, if we can deny China a successful invasion, then they will see that it's not in their best interest in precipitating that conflict, and then they're not going to have a great option. I think the one thing I would say to, you know, especially to Chinese viewers, would be that the risks of failing are extraordinary. So that is to say, if China tries to use force to forcibly unify with Taiwan and it fails, that is going to be terrible for China, because countries will not only see that China is dangerous, but also that it's resistible. So I think this is one of the things that we have in our quiver going forward. And again, we're not trying to support an independent Taiwan, but the idea being that China will need to, this is not going to war against Denmark in 1864 or something. This is a much different, and the U.S. shouldn't be discounted, even though we've lagged in focusing on Asia and the China problem. We are finally turning our attention to it, and we do still have the largest military in the world, or largest military spending in the world. So anyway, I know David wanted to get to questions, but you know, that's just some brief thoughts.
Now, many of the questions, in fact, touch on points you've made, so I'm sure you'll be able to return to them. As we get to questions, of which there are numerous, so we'll try to answer as many as possible, I'm obliged to give you a word from our sponsor, namely Asia Times. We're pleased to offer events like this to the public as free events, but to do so, we need the support of our readers, as indeed does every publication of the world. And like virtually every publication of the world, we live on subscription. So please do take the trouble to subscribe to Asia Times. And with that, first question involves the prospective role of Japan, either in terms of its deterrent capacity as a country with long-standing interests in Taiwan and an alliance with the United States, or its response to to hostilities in the case of Taiwan. What are the Japanese thinking? What have they been doing? How are they likely to respond?
Well, I guess I can jump in on this. But, yeah, I mean, I think this is a critical issue, and I think that the decision-making of Japan in the next few years is probably, along with that of Taiwan itself, is probably one of the most single important variables in whether this coalition of states that are seeking to balance China will succeed. I think Japan has been woefully derelict and delinquent on effectively resourcing its part of this anti-hegemonic coalition, as I call it. Actually, Uwe, you mentioned the West German military. I think that's kind of what we want from Japan, is a role more like West Germany in the post-war era. The reality is that the PRC is the largest economy in the world by some measures, and its military is tracking that capability. The United States has a flat defense budget, unfortunately has distractions in other theaters, and has to project power 5,000 to 10,000 miles away. You know, the Japanese government under Abe and under Suga has been very clear that China is a fundamental threat to Japanese interests, and yet defense spending remains at 1%. It's completely, I mean, I actually think it's almost irrational. So I think, you know, what I've been trying to argue in the Japanese press, it goes like this: Japan and Taiwan are like this. So, I mean, you know, there's an arms race going on, but only one side is running the actual race, which is China. So, you know, and I mean, I think, you know, this is, you know, the idea that Japan is a, you know, post-war stuff. I mean, I find those arguments kind of ridiculous 75 years later. The Bundeswehr was the most sophisticated military in Europe, probably more than the American army, just a decade or two after the Second World War. So there's no countries are going to be really worried about Japan rampaging around, because the Americans won't let them and the Chinese won't let them. But what won't work is if Japan just keeps doing what it's doing, 1% defense. Now, the defense minister indicated the other day that they are going to increase above 1%. But I mean, you know, that's way too little, too late. I think they should be doubling their defense spending. The question is, you know, Taiwan is clearly critical to the defense of Japan. It's essentially part of the same archipelago. Now, I don't mean that politically, but I mean from a geographic military planning point of view. And that's why it's always been part of the US defense perimeter since the Second World War. It's a big part of it. So if China were to subordinate Taiwan, it would directly impinge upon the security of Japan. I mean, China would have uninhibited access beyond the first island chain, including the eastern approaches of Japan, cut it off from the South China Sea, and of course, it'd be 100 miles from Okinawa at that point, and also 100 miles from Luzon, for that matter. So my point is, Japan can increase spending now, or it can wait until Taiwan has already fallen to the Chinese, in which case it'll probably have to increase spending by 10x if the Chinese let them at that point. That's my question. I don't know whether the Chinese would allow them to do that. So I think Japan's best course of action is to double defense spending right now at a minimum, but we'll see if that happens.
Yeah, I think one of our Asia Times correspondents, Bertil Lindner, who is quite knowledgeable about he used to write for Janes and so on. So he's did an assessment of the Japanese Navy at least, and said, well, if you're going to look at anything in Japan, the Navy is certainly capable and is capable of building out relatively quickly, and it would probably be the biggest significant contribution, for the defense perimeter. And that I think is something that is useful, because the Navy in this kind of situation, again, from the if you look at the situation historically between China and Japan, there's a great deal of hesitancy, I think, on both sides to get back into any kind of hot confrontation. And but Japan could do very well by building out its Navy very significantly, and thereby saying this is defensive, and indeed it is.
Right.
And
can't invade China with a Navy. Yeah.
That's right. So that's it. And I think that there is an opportunity for Japan to do this and do it right. That makes sense.
There are several other questions about other parts of Asia. One questioner asks about China's increasingly expeditionary military and the possibility of a miscalculation by either a U.S. ally or the U.S., a spiral of escalation of the South China Sea, the Chindian border and the Himalayas, and so forth. A related question, which I'll fold in, is that the Biden administration's March interim national security strategic guidance doesn't mention its mutual defense treaty with the Philippines. Where does the Philippines fit into America's strategic posture towards China? So I would take that as a green light to discuss other countries and geographic situations that might contribute to prospective hostilities.
Should I go, or?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Please,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I think based on how David has framed it, I think those are putting the finger on. I mean, look, I think, again, I look at it through kind of realistic points of view. I mean, most of the discussion of China tends to talk about intent or ideology, but the simple fact of the matter, I mean, China will have 3 aircraft carriers by the middle of the decade, and of course, amphibious forces and air assault, space architecture. I mean, you build a robust military space architecture because you want to see far from your shores, right? Otherwise, you could use ground-based systems like over-the-horizon radars. So whatever the Chinese are saying, what they're developing is a military that will be able to project power over long distances. And of course, clearly in the South China Sea and the Western Pacific, as well as, I think, the Indian Ocean to some extent. In fact, they've already conducted, I think, nuclear attack submarine patrols in the Indian Ocean. So that's the reality. And, who knows what they'll think in 5 years, but I mean, with Xi Jinping in power, plausibly, it's reasonable to think they're not going to be extremely, conservative or Deng Xiaoping-like. So that's the reality. And I don't think miscalculation is really the problem. I mean, I think it's more that I think we can see what China's strategy is right now. Hide and bide is dead. Nobody obviously believes in hide and bide anymore. And so the Chinese can't really go back to it, because once you've left it, you're not very credible going back to it. So really what I think China's trying, the good news for people on the American side and Japan and so forth, is there is this kind of coalition forming, right? I mean, the Quad I think sometimes is overhyped, but it's a good thing. US, Japan, Australia, India, some others here and there. there are people worried about China being domineering and kind of bossing everybody around and pushing people around in the region. As Yang Jiechi, I think, said to the ASEAN, we're a big country, you're a small country, you're supposed to do what you're told, more or less. I think China recognizes that and is basically, instead of using sweetness and light, is relying a bit more on force and threat and inducements, of course. Yes, money, but also, the wolf warrior diplomacy and force. And of course, there's a sense in which, that's going to backfire, but actually I think it could work. That's what I'm worried about, because, for instance, the Philippines, without the United States, it's completely prey to the Chinese military, right? And the Chinese are so bold and confident, they're even taking on the Indian military in Ladakh, which I think sends a signal throughout the region that, if they're willing to take on the Indians, nobody, Vietnam or whoever, Indonesia, you better watch out. And I think the message that they're trying to send, which is not stupid, is, stay in line or else. And so our responsibility is to make sure that countries have enough, countries that we're allied with in particular, and Taiwan, have enough confidence to help balance China. Again, not to push China around, but to get China to stay within, its side of the line, if you will. So I think that's the problem. But the problem is they're going to have a military going forward that's going to be able to make that a lot more difficult, because all those A2AD systems that are used for Taiwan, they're also relevant for Philippines or Vietnam. I mean, the Chinese already have operational control of the South China Sea in peacetime, right? So, I mean, they've got huge military bases. Some of the artificial islands in the South China Sea, which Xi Jinping told Barack Obama were not going to be militarized, are larger than the District of Columbia. So, I mean, we're not talking, it's not a people's war kind of military anymore. Now, the Philippines MDT, the Philippines is critical because if for nothing else, the geography is critical. I mean, in terms of US access across the Central Pacific and the ability to operate in the first island chain, it's obviously critical. And it's been a real source of frustration that we haven't been able to move forward in re-establishing our posture there, given the political conditions. So this is a real problem. And unfortunately, there's some degree of opportunity for China. I think it's a big mistake and it's something I've pointed out a lot. I think one of the problems with the very ideological take that the Biden administration is pursuing, that I think comes from the president himself, who's a true believer. I mean, he just said in his Memorial Day speech that, the central thing is democracy is a threat at home and abroad. I mean, they really see it through that lens. Well, I mean, the Philippines doesn't get very high ratings from Freedom House, but you know what? Neither does Vietnam, neither does Malaysia, neither does India, neither does Singapore, et cetera, et cetera. So, my view is, look, we love republicanism at home. We always stand for republicanism and dignified treatment of people. But our main point here is to ensure that there's a balance of power so countries don't get dominated. And I think that's a mistake. So I don't know what they were signaling. I do think there's some, the whole, issues with India, issues with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. I don't know where the Biden administration, I think they're aware that they probably went overboard in the first couple of months. But we'll see where they end up, because I think that the president and Secretary of State Blinken seem they're very ideological on this stuff. And I don't think that's the right assessment of the international environment.
Yeah, just David, if you allow me to briefly.
Yes, of course, go ahead.
Simply reinforce the last few lines of Elbridge there. I think it is absolutely essential that if this is going to be resolved, especially in the Asian theater, whether it's Filipinos or Koreans or India, I'm not so sure sometimes about the influence of religious and ideological issues. But as far as the rest of Asia is concerned, this really ultimately comes down to a pragmatic situation of, how do we fare in this kind of a game? And, we are a country, we are a nation, we have aspirations, and we want to be able to pursue them. And, don't screw with us. And I think, that's a situation that I think both China and the United States have to understand. In other words, the sometimes overbearing U.S. presence in the Philippines has obviously created issues. It has created issues in Southeast Asia elsewhere. And to the extent that, China is now encroaching, albeit with fishing fleets, on the Philippines is not making them any friends either. So this is an important thing. I think when we're looking at solutions in the Asian area, the pragmatic element of that, to the extent that it is emphasized, the realistic, as we would call it in the European historical context, would make a lot of sense.
A listener asks about the so-called Chinese doctrine of unrestricted warfare. By way of background, this was a theme in an obscure book by a couple of Chinese colonels published 20 years ago. It was made popular by Michael Pillsbury in his book, The 50-Year Marathon, and it alleges that China is going to use every possible method to subvert the West and undermine our power in all kinds of ways. I don't know if the panelists have a view. I will, however, say something about it, which is that if you read the book, which is freely available on the internet, the two colonels, Lau and Wang, argued strongly that China should not invest in high-tech military equipment because that didn't work for the Russians who lost the Cold War. What the Chinese did, what the People's Liberation Army did, was the exact opposite of what Lau and Wang represented, and both of them were sent out to pasture as academics rather than promoted in the PLA. So just as a matter of fact, I don't believe that this idea of unrestricted warfare has any relevance at all to what we're talking about, and to make a big deal of it just increases paranoia in a way that isn't helpful. That's my view, but Bridge or Uwe, if you'd like to comment, please go ahead.
No, I agree with you, David. I think that was, a kind of derivative of Mao's People's War, which was successful and all the rest of it. But even at the time of Quemoy and Matsu, when the United States made the nuclear threat, China pulled back. Nobody, I think, in China or then or now would want to risk a situation in which you say, we have 1.4 million people and you have whatever 300 some million, and you can kill 4 out of us, for each one of you. And this is gone. I don't think this is at all where China is right now. I think this is something that should be put to rest.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think they're building a military that's designed for, localized war under informationalized conditions, I think is the term in English, which is, basically designed. I mean, I think they are, from what we can see, in the public, I think they're developing the capability to inflict real hurt on the United States and others. But I think, frankly, the Marxists, I mean, again, the CCP, they are Marxist-Leninists, and Xi Jinping does seem to be a Marxist-Leninist, even if I don't think ideology is the central reality in international politics. That is true. But they studied Clausewitz, right? I mean, I think Lenin was a student of Clausewitz, right? I mean, so we experienced this hellishly in Korea, where the connection of military operations to political objectives. So and it's the infamous incident with the general saying to Chas Freeman in the 90s, you wouldn't trade Los Angeles for Taipei. Not only didn't work, it sort of backfired on China, so I don't think those kind of incredible threats are going to work. I mean, I think the Chinese are pursuing advantage in every domain of national power, but I don't, so what else is new, right?
A Japanese listener asks what the prospective role of Russia would be in the event of hostilities in the Pacific.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead first.
Okay. Well, look, I think the role of Russia, I mean, it's an anomaly in so many ways, sort of from a geopolitical point of view. I mean, clearly, this extremely tight relationship, historically speaking, between China and Russia is an anomaly when China is so powerful, and the obviously it's the intense alienation of Washington from Moscow, and also most of the Western, or actually all of the European capitals from Moscow. And Russia's done a lot of horrible things, but I think the fact is that over time, especially if China becomes more powerful and is able to pursue this strategy I kind of laid out advantageously, there will become a growing degree of convergence of interests between this coalition and Russia. Obviously from the coalition side, and people in Japan and Vietnam and India perfectly understand this, that we have an interest in Russia being along for the ride to help balance China and distract it, et cetera. But also from Russia's point of view, because look, I mean, if the Chinese are willing to use force against Vietnam and India and the Philippines and Taiwan and Japan and Australia to some, in various degrees, well, that's, and there's not a lot of love lost in that historical relationship. I mean, the reason that Mao decided to pursue the nuclear program after the Taiwan Straits crisis was because he thought the Soviets had betrayed him. And in 1969, Mao ordered the evacuation of Beijing because he was afraid of a Soviet first strike. So it's not like this is written in stone. But I think, we have to deal with, we who think this way have to deal with the reality that there is an intense political alienation. My view actually is that we should kind of draw a firm line in the West, and eventually Russia will see its interest in having a sort of an option with this coalition, even if that doesn't mean a full reconciliation. That at least means a distancing from China that would be advantageous to. I mean, the U.S. and China were not allies in the latter part of the Cold War, but the Soviets had to put several 100,000 troops in the Russian Far East to face off against the PLA.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there is demographic and geographical reasons why Russia or Siberia will always be attractive to a population mass of 4.1 billion to the south. A vacuum attracts that kind of attention. But let me just mention a totally different point. Because ultimately what people do, whether it's war or anything else, it's a question of intent. And in 1990, when the Germany is unified, 50,000 soldiers of the NVA, the National People's Army of East Germany, joined the Bundeswehr, the West German military forces. I was no longer active in the military, but I was still in the reserve, and had therefore the ability to talk to people and understand what's going on and so on. And whether it was the former East Germans or the Russians who we at that point had very direct access to, and it was very open in the early years, 1990, 1992, 3, 4. I had a lot of interesting discussions, and it's very clear, I think, that even Putin at the outset, at least, basically wanted to be a Westerner. His ambition was, let Russia become part of Europe as opposed to be principally oriented toward Asia, to the extent that there is a different way of, the so-called Eurasian view and so on and so forth. I think it's a very artificial one. It's still not going to last. I think the actual opportunities, if they were to be presented, and that's, I know, to have been the German policy of the current government, of the Merkel government, is simply do not push Russia away from us to a point where they will simply have no choice but to go somewhere else. And therefore, I think what happens in Asia, whether between Japan and China, Japan cannot move away from China. Okay, they're sitting there, and they have to find a way of living one way or another, or dying with China. But they cannot just move it away. But Russia, when all is said and done, I think most people, most Russians who are not just Eurasian ideologues, will tell you that this has to be the Russia of Peter the Great and not the Russia of anything else. And Peter the Great was a Dutch guy. Okay. There are a lot of strange assumptions being made, and the idea that Russia would take sides in military confrontation, I think they would make every damn possible effort to prevent that from happening in the first place.
Thank you. It's now 10 o'clock, but with everyone's indulgence, we'll go for another 15 or 20 minutes and try to attend to the rest of the questions. One listener asks, I'm putting words in his mouth, if we can't beat them, why not join them? Why doesn't the United States join with China and support the Belt and Road Initiative and the development of all these technologies in economic development and do this jointly instead of viewing this as a contest?
Well, I mean, I think human nature and the dictates of systems and how people behave. I mean, you don't, concerts like that don't work. These sort of G2 ideas don't work. I mean, look at the post-Cold War period or post-Napoleonic period. The incentives to push for advantage become too great. And I think you can see it happening. Frankly, you could see it in the United States after the end of the Cold War. In a lot of ways, we were kind of restrained during the Cold Wars in some respects in sort of our aggressive liberalism by the dictates of structure, by the fact that we had to focus on the Soviets. And after the Cold War, I mean, I think actually there's probably some Madeleine Albrights in the Chinese system right now. If we have this great military, why can't we use it? And I think, if we tried to do this kind of G2, well, then there would inevitably be disputes about who had the advantage where. And one side would think it would have more power, just like in any business negotiation or any partnership, right? And that would lead to its decay. And the problem with that situation is it's not just like you can try and fall back, because if you're not prepared for the fallback, then you're going to lose, basically. And the basic reason is that I think that China's, and I mean, we can sort of see it. I mean, doesn't take a lot of speculation, but China, I think, wants to create a large area over which it's kind of hegemonic, particularly a kind of a market area in which countries have to sort of, I mean, the classical term would be the kowtow. I mean, obviously, it's archaic, but basically have to take a buy or leave from Beijing on critical national security or economic decisions. That the whole trade system and the regulatory system would be oriented around China. That standards would be set in China. That the commanding heights of the international economy would be in China. And I mean, frankly, that sounds pretty great. I could understand why Chinese would want to pursue that, but it's not in our interest, not in Japan's interest, not in India's interest, not in Vietnam's interest, not in Australia's interest, and frankly, it's not in Europe's interest. So I think that's sort of the basic reason, is that we kind of we can see where this would go. So my whole view is we can see where this would go if we aren't prepared. So let's get prepared now, take the pain and friction, keep it below the level of conflict, if at all humanly possible. But if we can't avoid it, be ready for it. And then get to a position of strength where we can have a balance. I mean, I think to take Uwe's historical, about the end of the Cold War, I mean, and I think the foreign minister of Germany completely misses this point for the foreign minister Maos. I mean, the reason that could happen, why that intention could actually manifest, was because of people like Uwe who were serving on the inter-German border, not to mention the US nuclear deterrent. Without that, I mean, speaking of 1983 Germany, one of my favorite strategic documents, David, you and I might have talked about this, but is the German Defense White Paper the whole government released in 1983. It's a brilliant exposition of how in the nuclear era, the Soviets had, basically their strategy was to try to develop a military that could then basically kind of extract rents from West Germany and create a kind of Finlandized West Germany that would kind of follow its rules. Defeating that strategy by having the military buildup of the 1980s that David played such an important role in, that was critical to then enabling, okay, well, the Soviets' best decision at that point was to seek, and I don't think this is likely to happen with China, but seek a kind of a transformational relationship because they couldn't go on. But that, if they could have extracted the rents from West Germany, as David points out, they could have gone on. And so, we want a position with China where they're incentivized. I mean, the sort of counterpoint I'd make to Uwe's point is intent matters, but intent is takes place within a framework of, I mean, you guys are all businessmen, so this is old hat, but intent takes place within a framework of cost and benefit and risk. And so we want to frame that so China's best strategy is one that we can live with.
Yeah, look, I think on that thing, it's not, you know, this guy joining that guy or this guy joining that guy. I mean, there are you know, cultural historical differences of massive significance here, right? There was a German philosopher, Leibniz, who thought that the Chinese way of writing things was marvelous because it was transparent to language, right? You know, so you could have written German or Chinese in Chinese characters, and he just loved the idea. But you know, I suppose if he had actually gone to China at the time and had been asked whether or not he loved the idea of living there, that might have been a different response. I don't know. And the situation is that what we have to aim for is a realistic outcome in which the aspirations of China and of the United States, you know, actually can be pursued without leading to an actual, you know, hot military confrontation. And it just appears to me that there are a lot of avenues to prevent that from happening. I just think that, I mean, I know you don't like, Elrich, you don't like the term miscalculation, but I don't mean accident.
Well, miscalculation's okay. Yeah, no, that's a good term. It's more like accident I don't like so much. But,
right. I mean, accident, I agree with you. That's not what I'm talking about. But
yeah. Oh, okay.
Sort of egregious miscalculation that leads to a confrontation that with any, you know, bit of sense of pragmatism could have been avoided. And I think that's
completely, yeah.
That's the best thing we can aim for. I mean, I don't.
But yeah.
You know,
can I say on that? Because I think you're right. And just briefly, I mean, I actually think miscalculation is the problem. And that's why I think that we need to be clear and capable, because I think the most, I mean, this is all, nobody knows. There's no right answer because it's all, I don't know, dependent on you know, interactive. But I completely agree. I mean, go back to the World War I example briefly, because it is salient. We sort of don't know why it happened. But I would say one of the key points was Germany's miscalculation that Britain wouldn't intervene, or I mean, wouldn't intervene sufficiently quickly to make a difference. And, you know, that's an, you know, most of the time people say World War I happened because of too much aggressiveness, but maybe if the Brits had been more forward leaning and even had forces on the continent already, ideally, maybe Germany wouldn't have made that miscalculation, but that was clearly a miscalculation. But, you know, as you know, Uwe, but I'm just explicating the point. Miscalculation can happen in both directions. It can happen because people fear threatened, but also because they feel too much opportunity when it's not actually there.
Oh, absolutely.
Parenthetically, I wrote years ago that the real tragedy of World War I is that Germany didn't take the opportunity to get the first Morocco crisis in 1905 to launch a preemptive attack on France when Russia was busy with its revolution, and the Entente Cordiale hadn't really, the ink hadn't quite dried. That would have been nasty for France, but at least it would have been over quickly. We wouldn't have had World War I, at least not then in that form. But in any event, that's counterfactual history is best left with fan fiction, I think. Bridge, before we go on to the next question, so that our viewers can follow your work better, after leaving the Defense Department, you founded something called the Marathon Initiative. If you want to spend a minute talking about what you're doing now, I think our listeners would like to hear.
Great. No, thank you, David. Yeah, the Marathon Initiative I founded with my partner and good friend, Wes Mitchell, who is the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe at the beginning of the Trump administration. And both of us believe that, you know, there's a lot of great work coming out of the think tanks, but where the gap was in a sense what think tanks were originally, I think, designed to do, which was to provide a space for people with policy expertise and background, but also a kind of a rigorous bent of mind to spend a lot of time and have the political sort of organizational freedom and support to do long-term strategic thinking that's sort of rigorous, but also practically valuable to the US government and other friendly governments. And so that's really what we're doing. The main thing I'd mention to your listeners, if they're interested, if they want to hear me bloviate on more in writing or an audiobook, I have a book coming out called The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Era of Great Power Conflict from Yale University Press. Will be available in September. But that's the main kind of fruit of the last couple of years since leaving the Pentagon. In a way, Uwe, or you kindly mentioned the National Defense Strategy. I mean, that's a bureaucratic document. I think we hopefully made some progress, but this is the sort of, since we're talking about philosophers, I kind of think of it as the Platonic version in a way, no bureaucratic or linguistic compromises, but anyway, that people might be interested.
Thank you. And of course, if you'd like to give us a preview, the pages of Asia Times are open to you.
Thank you.
One more question, and I think this might be the last. One of our listeners is a businessman active in China who agrees with the Michael Pettis thesis, namely that China is going to enter a period of extremely slow growth. I happen to disagree with that, but it certainly is a well-argued thesis, which not just Professor Pettis, but many other people share. Hypothetically, assuming that thesis is correct, how would that affect the strategic discussion we've been having?
Well,
this is something I've been. Oh no, go ahead, Uwe. Sorry, please.
Yeah, no, I just so happens that I know Michael quite well, and we've often had the opportunity to sit around in a small little Japanese bar in Tsimsha-tsui here in Hong Kong and talk about this. Michael is an astonishing guy. I mean, he has been teaching at Peking University, which is the Harvard of China, and that's not trying to diminish Harvard. And,
well, I'll leave comment. David and I can talk about it another time about the status of elite education in the United States. But anyway,
Michael is a contrarian, and Michael is also very much a sort of a Keynesian guy good with the numbers and all the rest of it. I think what he overlooks, and I've told him that all the time, is that what's driving the Chinese economy at this point is got nothing to do with this thing of, you reach middle age and then you sort of slow down. I mean, I think China is not slowing down. I think China is economically making the most optimal use of its resources to technologically advance and to spread the technological advances in the sort of broad economic development, and that's where I think Michael is wrong, but he is a very persuasive guy.
Well, I'll just say, I mean, I'm actually, you gentlemen know a lot more, and I think the viewers do as well. Actually, I'd love to hear your at greater length sometime. My instinct is with you. I mean, Uwe, I think touched on at the end. I mean, if nothing else, China still has hundreds of millions of people, if not in poverty, then something not so far from it. So, I mean, just bringing those people out is a pretty good basis for continued growth. I mean, it's not, Europe or Japan where you have a population that's largely already kind of, upper income, and now you have to have fundamental breakthroughs. But he could be right. I mean, I think as a sort of foreign policy strategist, I mean, my view is we should be prepared for the range of outcomes, obviously, particularly the kind of more plausible ones. I've been thinking about this for some time. I think the strategy that I'm laying out is actually resilient across those outcomes, because if Uwe and David are right, then we're on the right trajectory, which is we're prepared, but not so provocative that we're, China thinks that we're trying to, burn the summer palace kind of thing. But we're prepared, and it's going to be somewhat expensive, but we'll defray the costs across, and we're fundamentally a defensive military position. If Michael is right, Michael Pettis is right, then worst case, we've wasted some money on the military. But I'd rather have that than the reverse, which is underprepare and have China achieve domination of Asia, and from that position, global preeminence, in the interest of, I guess, saving money on defense in the near term, especially given that our rate of expense. And I'm not sort of theological at all in terms of increasing the defense budget. I want to keep it as low as feasible, but no lower, in a sense. But, you know, I mean, we're spending around 3%, which is much, much lower than we spent in the Cold War, and Japan could spend a lot more. So I think this is, you know, I'd rather err on the safe side given the range of potential outcomes.
Yeah, I just a quick footnote on that. I forgot the guy's name, but there's been a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, economics professor, who for the past 2 decades has been questioning the growth of the GDP of China, and it couldn't have possibly been as high, and it was all exaggerated. And I met the guy at some point, and you know, in New York, I guess it was, at some conference or seminar or whatever. And I asked him, "Have you ever been to China recently?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, look, I sort of live there, at least across the border, and there is no bloody way in which the GDP could have been wrong and Shenzhen could have been built." Okay. And you know, all you need to do is look at what is actually happening in China, and you know, to see, yes, of course there's always going to be a slowdown of some sort, and you know, there's no question about it. Just like there's a slowdown in economic growth, there's a slowdown in population growth. China is struggling with that right now, and it's got nothing to do with the 1 or 3 member or whatever children family. It's got something to do with the fact that when you reach, you know, middle class, or when, you know, 1/3 or 2/3 of your population reach upper middle class status, yeah, well then, you know, that slows down. You know, you have fewer children. We've seen that everywhere. You know? So anyway, so Michael, I appreciate Michael Pettis, his views. At the same time, I think China is on a different path.
And with that, gentlemen, I thank you for a really enlightening, lively, and informative discussion. I'd like to thank our many listeners who tuned in, and particularly those who submitted questions. We'll be back to you shortly with another webinar announcement for mid-June. So stay tuned, and please do subscribe to Asia Times. With that, many thanks again, and we'll close this session.
Thank you very much, Albert.
Thank you. Thank you, Uwe. Thanks, David.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you all.